So, we need to talk about the Fantastic Four. Not because there's something grinding my gears with Marvel's first family, but because they bear a striking resemblance to another group that has been lost in the gutters of comics history. To understand what I mean, we have to look at the FF's creation, starting with this guy, Jack King Kirby. Jack Kirby is the man, and I love him, but this isn't just a Jack Kirby video, so I'll move forward. In the 1950s, Jack Kirby was doing a lot of contract work for a number of companies, including one called National Comics Publications. That's not a name that will ring bells for many of you, but the company it later becomes probably does. DC Comics. While freelancing for DC, Jack Kirby creates a few characters in 1957 called The Challengers of the Unknown, alongside Joe Simon and Dick and Dave Wood. Kirby writes and co-writes this team for 8 issues and one uncredited story under the Showcase title. Then some stuff happens. Namely, Kirby begins working on another title called Sky Masters of the Space Force. That's Sky right there. I thought it was a bunch of guys who were the Sky Masters of the Space Force, but it actually is just that one guy, Sky Masters, who is of the Space Force. Anyway, according to Mark Evanier's book, Kirby, King of Comics, there's a dispute between Jack Schiff, the editor of Sky Masters of the Space Force, and Jack Kirby about the series royalties. Schiff wins his lawsuit against Kirby, and Kirby decides to leave DC. Kirby returns to another company that he has freelanced for called Atlas Comics. You might not know that name either, but I'm sure you know what it evolves into, which is Marvel Comics. So Kirby's back at Atlas Comics. What's the situation there? Well, according to legend, a lot of golfing is happening. It's believed that the head of Atlas Comics frequently played golf with one of the 2 heads of National Comics Publications, DC Comics, and at one point, they were discussing the success of the Justice League. Both heads of National at the time claimed that this did not happen, but who knows. Afterwards, the head of Atlas Publishing, Martin Goodman, returns to the office and calls one of his editors, Stan Lee. Yeah, that's an actual picture of him from the 1960s. I threw it in here just to keep you on your toes. I'll replace it with this one, but pay attention, we're covering a lot of ground here. Goodman looks at Lee and says, "Hey, can we do a team book like Justice League?" And Stan Lee says, "Sure," or "Excelsior," or whatever. And Lee claims that this gives him the drive to write the kind of comic he would like to see on shelves, one with a lot more heart and character to it. Lee comes back to his boss with the idea for the Fantastic Four and with Jack Kirby to draw it. In 1961, the Fantastic Four debut. What a lovely story, right? Wrong. Well, not wrong, maybe just not how it actually happened. According to Evanier's book, quote, Kirby would say that wasn't how they ever worked. That even on short, unimportant romance stories, there'd be a plot conference and then he'd be sent off to pencil pages as he saw fit, with or without a typed plot. He'd say he came up with the characters and even point to how similar the origin was to Challengers of the Unknown, end quote. Let's rewind back to 1957 and look at the Challengers of the Unknown. A group of 4 strangers are on their way to make a TV appearance, but their plane crashes. Upon escaping the wreckage, one of the men sees that his watch is completely unscathed and still ticking. They take this as a sign that they are living on borrowed time. However, they also believe that since they've faced the ultimate unknown, death, they'd quite like to keep facing other unknowns with the time that they have left, whatever that means. These 4 unfortunate flyers are Ace, the war hero pilot, Rocky, an Olympic athlete and renowned strongman business mogul, Red, a stunt daredevil and thrill seeker, and Professor Haley, a scientist and expert skin diver, not what you think. Also, for some reason, he's Professor Harrison in a couple of issues of Showcase, but that gets changed back to Haley in future ones. Later, a woman named June, the world's expert on robots and computers, joins the team, and they spend their days investigating mysteries, going to different planets, and fighting threats to Earth. June also becomes blonde at one point, then changes her hair color back to its original color, and then back to blonde. It's kind of inconsistent, but just so you know, that's June whenever you see a woman with the Challengers. I only point this out because there's no narrative reason for it happening. It seems to be more of an editorial issue. If June wanted to exercise body autonomy and change her hair color and hairstyle anytime she wanted, 100% for it, but otherwise it's just kind of confusing. So, this is a good concept. So good it runs for 87 issues, which is quite a lot considering the Silver Age of comics was rife with ideas coming and going. Now, let's look at the Fantastic Four. Scientists Reed Richards and Susan Storm fly into space with Susan's brother Johnny and Reed's pilot friend Ben Grimm. While in space, they are bombarded with cosmic rays that cause their ship to crash land on Earth. Now that they are terrestrially settled, they find that the cosmic rays have bestowed upon them fantastic powers, like an elastic body, invisibility, flight and fire control, and a form made of solid rock. Ben, aka The Thing, gets the raw end of the deal here if we're being honest. We already know the Fantastic Four is successful as a franchise with comics, movies, video games, cartoons, and more. But that isn't the focus here. What is the focus are the similarities. Take a look at these two teams. Notice anything? Well, for one, they're both drawn by Jack Kirby. Their outfits are similar, their inciting incident is similar, their team makeup is similar. Yeah, the Challengers have one extra guy, but let's go into that for a minute. What if we took Ace's job, Pilot, and gave it to the strongman Rocky? That basically just makes Ben grim. Now the Challengers have a young daredevil, a scientist, a rough-and-tumble pilot, a woman who's a scientist. Oh, that team looks really familiar. Here's a story where Rocky goes up in space and comes back down, changed by the journey, and has fire powers and visibility and can change his size? Huh. That sounds familiar. Now, after Kirby leaves DC to go to Marvel, Red and Rocky begin to butt heads a lot more on the team, very similarly to Ben and Johnny. Ace gets into a relationship with June, so just take that from him and give it to Professor Haley, and you have Reed and Sue. I don't want to say Kirby or Lee copied what was going on at DC with the Challengers dynamic, but is it a coincidence that years prior to the Fantastic Four's publication, DC Comics had a book that is eerily similar in so many ways? It's possible. Is it equally possible that Jack Kirby was so pissed about losing his lawsuit with Jack Schiff, he reskinned a previous idea as a big middle finger, and Stan Lee filled it with the stories he wanted to see without having to come up with the cast whole cloth? My money's on that. Comics are wild, and the early days of this industry are rife with stories just like this. What's also fascinating to me is the trajectory that both of these groups have in terms of their popularity and success. Obviously, the Fantastic Four is winning in the categories of public consciousness, success as a franchise, and being a pillar of the publishing company's mythology. The Challengers, well, are none of those things. The 60s come and go with the Challengers disappearing from the publication's roster. There's a brief resurgence in the Super Team Family series during the 1970s, and then they get their own book again, but it eventually gets canceled. There's two runs in the 90s, one at the start of the decade and one at the end, totaling a whopping 26 issues. Once more, they return for 6 more issues in the mid-2000s to no avail. Multiple reboots happen in the New 52 and afterwards in 2018, but all of them get canceled. I would also like to point out that the rosters change pretty dramatically as well. While this is cool, and I love seeing team reinventions, it likely meant they were starting from square one with fans. That's a dicey proposition for a relatively obscure team from the 60s. I'm gonna have to read these runs at some point because they sound interesting, but judging by their absence in DC's overall zeitgeist, I'm gonna assume they were not that successful for one reason or another. The team does make noticeable appearances in a variety of crossover events, though. Superboy finds a few of the Challengers hidden away in Hyper Time, which we will talk about later. And a couple of the Challengers also participate in Infinite Crisis. Oh, yeah, they also have some fun cameos in the Batman Brave and the Bold TV show, Teen Titans, and Scooby-Doo? Awesome. Bottom line, though, their appearances are essentially Easter eggs. My favorite version that I've read so far, though, is their appearance in Darwin Cook's New Frontier series that came out in 2007. It's an Elseworld title, so I didn't include it in the other stuff mentioned earlier since it exists outside of continuity, but this, in my opinion, is a really fun version of them. All 4 men are noticeably changed after the harrowing crash and have trauma bonded in a way that allows for these disparate personalities to find common ground. I love the idea that after a near-death experience, they are all drawn to the idea of danger. Red even says here, "It's crazy, baby. Like nothing's big enough to see anymore." A man who routinely risks his life for entertainment finally encountered something he believed would kill him, and after surviving, the world feels dull and empty of mystery. Now, listless and haunted, he's in search of meaning, kinship, and excitement. Luckily, there are 3 others feeling the same way. Contrast that with what we see in the 1960s in this panel where their immediate response is, well, what else is there to do? Living, as they say, on borrowed time, they believe the best thing for them to do is be super science daredevils, or troubleshooters for hire. Is this the same end result we see in New Frontier? Sure. But the way Darwin Cook arrives at it, with a tinge of fear, sympathy, and humanity, makes a more compelling narrative. Had this been what we saw in the Silver Age, I think they would have continued on much longer. As it stands, the crash serves to be a dramatic event that lends itself perfectly to the genre. The foursome get uniforms, a base of operations in the Colorado Rockies they refer to as Challenger Mountain, and tons of gadgets that no private organization should have. Seriously, look at this. They're developing weapons-grade technology with absolutely no oversight. Professor Haley should be on a government watch list. And how do you buy an entire mountain? I think New Frontier says that Rocky is some kind of business tycoon, but he makes enough money to hollow out and decorate a mountain. Meanwhile, June is a member of what I affectionately call the Instigation Nation, characters whose purpose is to start the momentum of the plot. She brings the challengers new and exciting tasks to sink their teeth into. While she starts out as the director of some scientific program in her first appearance, she joins the team, but suffers the same fate of most women during the Silver Age. Her character loses depth, and she becomes relegated to the token girl of the group, romantically entangled with Ace for no other reason than the writing and editorial team decided it. In later iterations this changes, but where the Silver Age is concerned, it's a fairly lost cause. All in all, the idea that these men have already conquered death and have nothing more in their lives except putting themselves in further danger or exploring various unknowns is exciting, sure, but there's a lack of meat on the bone. With no personal stakes or depth to their characters, the reader's reason to care quickly becomes dependent on how exciting each outing can be. There are attempts to add substance to the characters at times, but they're often arbitrary conflicts. There's one instance where June tells the men they have to stop bickering about who the leader of the team is, a thing they've never done before that issue. She throws a gauntlet that is both dangerous and wholly unnecessary to determine who becomes king under the Challenger Mountain. In the end, Ace is victorious, but it's a hollow achievement as there was never any question about this, nor need for a leader, when the team seemed to function perfectly fine as a unit. Rocky, the brawn of the group, gets more brain than he bargained for in a scientific accident and subsequently becomes a huge jerk. Ace is embroiled in a plot having to do with an old villain from his World War II flying days, which really makes you question how old Ace is, but don't think too hard about it. Stories like this are fun, and highlighting a specific member does give you a little morsel that might whet your appetite for the next issue, but it clearly does not do enough. The writers don't lean into it. This is doubly evident when the writers just return things to the status quo. It's like the story had no purpose. If we look at the Fantastic Four, we can see that the drama Marvel brought to their characters was superior. I'm not saying that the plots are so much better, but their use of characters and focus on relatability was ultimately the right move. It's the company's bread and butter, and what makes their books appealing to a lot of readers. Man, a lot of food metaphors in the last few minutes. What is that about? The Thing's inner, and often outer turmoil at the transformation that's overtaken his body, Reed and Sue's slow burn relationship, Johnny's relatability and youthful exuberance all serve to give nuance. Not to mention, in the first 5 issues of the Fantastic Four, you have Doctor Doom, Namor, the Skrulls, and Johnny leaving the team due to his and Ben's drama. There's a lot going on. The challengers occasionally disagree, but ultimately they return to that status quo at the end of each issue, and their villains are less than exciting. Here's Multi-Man, a guy who gets a new power every time he dies. He doesn't get all of them continuously, he erases the previous one and gets a new one. It's a pretty strange concept and honestly doesn't have the pizzazz of the Riddler or Lex Luthor. Then there's the League of Challenger Haters, which, I kid you not, is just a group of people the Challengers have beaten who decide to get together and fight them. Many of them are so obscure that when you see the roster, they have to remind you who that person is because it's been so long since their first appearance. The rest of their foes are one-off criminals, monsters, or alien threats. Beyond that, the voices of the challengers ring nearly the same. Each is a tough guy with a specialty. Rocky eventually gets a semi-beatnik vernacular, but it doesn't alter the fact that they all handle guns, fight baddies, and are equally brave. Sure, Ace flies the jet, and Professor Haley's a Swiss Army scientist who makes the gear, but Rocky and Red are almost the same character save for their age and hair color. Meanwhile, Reed sciences with a capital S. Johnny is brash, quick to act, and has a mind for fixing up cars. Ben is prone to fits of anger, sullen, and, I reiterate, a rock man. Sue is, unfortunately, the woman. Remember, folks, it was the 60s. They had no idea how to write women well, but hey, she makes the uniforms. More often than not, she is a captive or prize to be fought over. There are moments where her invisibility comes in handy and she distracts or nabs an item, but it's nowhere near as impactful as the men on the team. There were also format differences. The Challengers was a series, like many DC was publishing at the time, that housed 2 stories per issue. Sometimes this duplex format would change once or twice a year to give us a cover-to-cover story, but for the most part the book read like Superman, The Flash, or Batman did in structure. Tight, 12-page narratives that had to be wrapped up succinctly so that the next one could get onto the page. I want to be clear here, too, I like Challenger stories. They're fun, popcorn action that deliver exactly what they say they will. A group of people tackling the strange and scary and winning. It's great. Not everything has to be Kingdom Come or Kraven's Last Hunt. Fantastic Four was doing something different, though. Each of their stories were full-issue tales. This allows for the characters to breathe more and the stories to have a bit more excitement. I'm not saying that they were worthy of awards, but when you use your full 24, you get better pacing. Truncated stories in 12 pages can work, but a lot of the time you have to expedite things in a less than satisfying manner. Let's put it this way. The Challengers were all steak, no sizzle, while the Fantastic Four was all sizzle, no steak. Oh my god, I'm hungry. That's what it is. Let me elaborate on this a little more. The Challengers had fun stories that worked on a tried and true formula. Their steak was good, but they were not exciting as characters, which was the sizzle that they lacked. Meanwhile, the Fantastic Four got away with okay stories, but had tons of sizzle coming from their powers, the drama, and colorful bad guys. That's what Fantastic Four stories bank on, plots that were ordinary for the genre with extraordinary characters. Fantastic Four was also the only series of its kind at Marvel at the time, predating the Avengers and the X-Men by 2 years. I dug around and found out what else DC was publishing that might be closely related to the Challengers in terms of groups of people in uniforms fighting stuff, and boy, oh boy, I think we found another obstacle. The Losers, a group of soldiers from all branches of Special Forces published in GI Combat and Our Fighting Forces. Haunted Tank, which was also coming out in GI Combat and was about, you guessed it, a haunted tank and the crew who drove it. Piloted it, I don't know what the right terminology is there. GI Combat, a War Stories anthology series. Our Army at War, another anthology series about World War II soldiers. The War That Time Forgot. World War II soldiers fight dinosaurs. That's it. That's the tagline. The Suicide Squad, the original group appearing in Brave and the Bold with no supervillains. Star-Spangled War Stories, yet another anthology comic with World War II stories in it. Black Hawk, a group of aerial aces who fight bad guys. It is highly likely that the Challengers, who had their own title and were not published in anthologies like many of these other teams, stood out among the crowd. But many of these teams are very, very similar to each other. Fatigue from so much sameness across the DC brand might have contributed to the public losing interest in the boys at Challenger Mountain. I mean, look, if I was to take the titles off of some of these covers and present you with just the art, you might believe that some of them are from the same comic, especially if you think they're part of an anthology series that publishes unrelated action stories. The thing that differentiates what you're looking at are uniforms, or in the case of the Suicide Squad and the Losers, the lack thereof, or non-cohesive outfits. Sure, the War That Time Forgot stories have soldiers fighting dinosaurs in them, but so does this Black Hawk issue, so who knows if they're in the same comic or not. Here's a bunch of dudes with guns shooting strange machines. Oops, those guys do it too. Well, these guys are pilots, but so are these guys, and one of these guys too. Well, the Challengers are living on borrowed time. Yeah? Well, the Losers are born to lose, so there. The point I'm making here is that the series elevator pitch of guys with no superpowers running and gunning may have stopped being interesting. Readers might have been looking for something more, and the Challengers may not have had it. 2 series that bear the fingerprints of one of comics' most influential creators. The Challengers were, and are, an interesting part of DC Comics history that may have provided some DNA during the creation of one of Marvel's flagship titles. As a franchise that had a lot of promise, the company clearly tried to resurrect the title multiple times. Unfortunately, the only challenge they couldn't conquer was getting the interest of readers. The Fantastic Four, however, continues to be a mainstay in Marvel's catalog, and likely will continue to be for years to come. I hope all this was interesting to you. Thanks for following this wild hare with me. See you next time.